Okay, so it's Saturday morning, November what is today? The 22nd or something
Second.
like that?
Yep.
Yeah. And I don't think, in this go around, I don't think I've ever done a podcast on Saturday morning. So I'm probably more relaxed than usual. And today I have not only a very important guest, but a dear friend of mine. And we've been journeying together for a while. Sometimes we won't talk for a while, but then when we connect, you got those friends where it's just like you just pick up wherever it was and you don't even need to apologize and whatever. I've never had Martha apologize to me for being out of contact, nor I to her because we just don't operate that way. Some other friendships will have that component. I have Martha Hopler, who I learned something new about Martha today as we were just chatting to jump on this recording. She is Martha Elaine Hopler.
Yes, I
I
am.
didn't know. I didn't know. So Martha Elaine Hopler, welcome to From the Belly.
Thank you, Doug. And just so we know, yes, auto correct is always the way to get your name up on the board.
I like it. Well, I'm Douglas James Wheeler.
No, there we go. I think you
And
should add it.
I probably should add that. So this is episode, if I did my math correctly, this is episode 19 of this new season of Why Not Church or maybe Why Church. And I always like to enunciate or emphasize that I imagine I'm having a conversation with somebody out in the world, be it here in my community of McMinnville, and somehow they find out I go to church, or maybe I sound too apologetic when I tell them that I do attend church. But I always want to say, do you got a moment for me to tell you that there was a long stint of time that I didn't attend church? Somehow I want to be understood from this is something that's been problematic for me.
Yeah.
And it's not a horse with three legs, but sometimes it's a horse with a bit of a limp for me in regards to, okay, do I really want to be back on this horse and do I want to stay in the ride and it's a bit bumpy? But I have deeper convictions than ever that for me, at least in this point in my life, I want and need to be in a community of faith, like inside of a building. But, there's a story there. So I'm talking to somebody in the community and I say to them, well, why not church? And they say back some kind of statement or story around, but why church? Why church? And they've got a story there, or they don't have a story, but they've read the headlines and all this stuff with church. The other day, I was talking to a potential guest, and he said, I'm a professor in a seminary type setting, and Christian is kind of all over the narrative of what I do, the classes that I teach, Judeo Christian stuff. But he said, Doug, does it make sense that I'm not that kind of Christian? And I went, yeah, I think that makes total sense. I think we'll have a good time in the interview. So,
That sounds good.
this is episode 19 from the belly. Martha was, I should have done my math better,
And
but
I'm not a professor.
she's not a professor. Well, okay. You might not have that credential,
No,
but
I don't.
you
I'm a
got a lot to,
social worker,
okay.
and I'm very proud of being a social worker.
Well, you got a lot to say about this church context because you grew up in it, you've been around it, you've been in it, you've been outside of it. So it was episode maybe 10 or 11 of the first run of 65 episodes of From the Belly that Martha Hopler and I talked. And that was a
That's
wee
right.
bit of time ago. So here we are again. And our topic is why not church or maybe why church? And Martha and I talked beforehand, and she wants to roll from we're better together, and what it means to be in a community of, I made a note, of connection and kindness. So, yes, her bio is she's a social worker through and through. And where do you want to start on this? You want to share a bit of your story of how you were born into the church? I mean, you're cradle something in that space, and maybe
Cradle
talk about that
something
for a
is
minute.
that's a good way to say it.
Okay.
Cradle something. I am what is known as a missionary kid. My parents were missionaries in Kenya, Africa, and I was born in Nairobi, Kenya. And I always feel like I was running alongside the church because when you get into denominations in America, they always want to attach you to something. And so now I'm always asked, were they Baptist missionaries? And the answer is no. They were part of African Inland Mission. And so church was the thing that we went to because the work required it, not because that's what you did. So my dad was a teacher, but he was also one that wanted to create leadership within the African community in a way that would allow the Africans to lead themselves. And he had a strong compassion for love being the winner. I lived in a house where my mother was the truth is the truth. And then my father would remind everyone that yes, love wins. And somehow the dance was throughout my life. But in those years that we lived in Kenya, because we only lived there for my parents were there for 10 years. We came home for furlough in 1970 with the expectation we would return in 1 year. I remember because I was of that age where my dad was trying to help me as a 6 year old understand that we would come back. And I always call it my first casket, which was a big crate he built where he put all our toys, my toys. And I remember him building it and him saying, "This is where your toys will be, and we will come back here." We did not return. And the reason we didn't return is because my dad had been asked by the Africans, "How is it in America with our brothers and sisters, the blacks there?" And my dad was somebody, when he didn't know the answer to something, he went to find it. And so we spent the next 4 years while we were supposedly on furlough and living in a missionary house. And I was going to American school, going over to Newark, New Jersey, and starting a mission that would that's that still tells the story today. My mom continued it after his death in 1978, where there is a crossover between African Americans in the States and Africans in there. But one of the things that always stands out to me for that I learned as a young child was how leadership should run. My dad said to the Africans, "If I'm going to lead you, what do I need to do so I can learn from you?"
Mm.
And the answer was get chickens. So we had about 30 chickens herd. And it's the point of when you're crossing cultures, you want to come from the under to the top, not the top to the bottom.
Mm.
And I have lived that way and sometimes gotten in quite a bit of trouble for my
Mm.
attitude of I don't know. I don't like not knowing. So it's sometimes hard for me. I have people say to me, "You're a know it all." And I say, "Yes, I am." Because knowing is easier. It gives me a
Mm.
path of security, but it also, as a white, as someone who has power just because of the color of my skin, I need to be aware of that at all times. So I have fast forwarded. I lived in Philadelphia for 20 years and was a social worker, worked in an organization that was a Christian organization, but my job was to work with families in crisis before the kids went into foster care, or that was what I ended up
Mm.
doing. And that was my favorite because I was the girl on the street that kind of held families in crisis together and
Mm.
only had to place one child into foster care or one family throughout that time because of my ability to like I have an adrenaline for excitement sometimes. And but one of the questions I had as I became an adult, because now I'm no longer a missionary kid, I'm
Mm.
just the girl at church, but I have a history. And I can't tell you how many times I've been mistaken for my mother. People will start telling me how my family changed, my husband changed their life, and
I got you.
I have to smile. Sometimes I just pretend, and sometimes I would say, "I'm not my mom. I'm not Marcia. My name's Martha." "Oh, I didn't realize." Because my dad in 1978 was already talking about urban ministry, African American. So some of the things that are happening now, I grew up with in my home.
Mm.
We kind of, what I call is, we ate it for dinner. I remember the first time I was in a mall and my dad said to a friend we were with, "I think everyone is a racist in America. You don't really have a choice. You've been to think through
Wow.
that." I was
Wow.
probably 8 years old, but those words came back to me many times.
Mm.
But the crisis I had with the church was it wasn't equaling what I knew as a social worker. I knew the underbelly. We talk about the underbelly of the story. I was in those homes. Those people would not feel comfortable. And I was in an African American church at the time. But I kept thinking, why do we not make space? If we believe that the gospel is true and it will reform people, why do we not make space for the things they need to be reformed from? Why do we demand that when you show up in church, you're already okay? My
Mm.
sister and I used to joke because would sit next to each other and they had testimony time. And testimony time was the time to tell everyone that God had taken care of it. And we had a running joke that if a man said, God has healed my marriage, you were going to hear the word divorce in the next month. And I think about 4 times I counted on it. I'm not criticizing the people in the church. My question was the system
Yeah.
that we set up, the
Yeah.
system that says when I show up into church, my kids need to look perfect. They need to sit in a row. I mean, my mom used to do it to us in Kenya. I sat on a bench. You held your hands. If I acted
Yeah.
out, it was promised what was going to be happening. Mom was much more aware of what other people thought. My dad was more concerned about what I thought. And both, I think, are important because we were representing something. But there
Hmm.
was a running joke. And I always joke I was allowed to ask any question I wanted in my house. don't
In
raise
my
your
house.
don't raise your church, partially because it was out of now I would say it's out of context. But so that was the beginning of my life, and part of the reason I talk about that is because trying to land in a church was really hard as an adult.
Mm.
I mean, I had my dad died when I was 14, so in 1978 my world went from
Mm.
a very secure, we know what we're doing kind of
So you've
life.
been back. Let's see. Did you say that you came from Kenya? You came back to the States in '70.
Yes. So we had been
So
in the
8 years
States
later,
for eight
Dad
years.
passed.
We had spent 4 years, and my life was always a dual life. I always lived in two worlds. Didn't matter the fact that we lived in America, because I went to a very white, missionary oriented family church that my dad had. That's who supported my dad. He had grown up,
Uh,
he had been in that church. He taught me how to talk to God, and he told God, he said, I will go to the mission field, but I do not want to have to do deputation. I do not want my family to have to travel for the entire year that we're home. So I need one church. Well, this church was a young church.
mm.
It had quite a bit of money and they wanted to do missions. And so they said, you will be our first missionary and we will support you fully. We did have two other churches in New York that we would go and visit. For the most part, I didn't know until my dad went to Fuller that most missionary families spend their entire year traveling all over the country to talk to the different churches that they're
Wow.
supported by. So in 1970 to 74, then in 74, when I was 10, we moved to California and we lived in Pasadena because dad went to Fuller for a year. He had started talking to Peter
Mm.
Wagner and some others about this idea of church. And meanwhile, in those 4 years, we would go either to my home, what was I call my home church, or we would drive into Newark, New Jersey, which was in the 70s, looked like a war zone. It was a war zone.
Mm. Mm.
And I remember the first time we drove through, I was like, okay, we've seen it. Let's go home. I was very
Mm.
secure I needed security in knowing that my world wasn't going to totally fall apart. My dad was a adventure man. I didn't mind adventure as long as he was in charge. But it was a very different world. Church went
Mhm.
for 2 hours to 3 hours. But one of the things that I will always say that I learned and was given in that time was an understanding that Black men weren't dangerous because I met about 5 very tall, very strong, dark African American men, and they were amazing. They stayed in my life until they died, or they still are in my life.
Mm.
And when
Mm.
people ask that, the reason I bring that up is I've heard this question over and over is how do we help our children not be racist? And I say, you do your work. You
Mhm.
take yourself and you put yourself in places and your kids watch that.
So in some ways, that's go raise chickens.
Yes. Go raise chickens, have yourself experiences. Like I had to have experiences, and my dad was terrified that I was going to, I was saying, get us out of here. And
Mm.
my mom realized that I needed more. I just needed to be in like church group where somebody was in charge. And if we were there for a long time, my dad would promise we went to Gino's after church. And Gino's is a hamburger place in
Mhm.
Newark, New Jersey. I could probably find it for you if we were there. But there were ways in which but the other thing that I have discovered about missionary kids that I didn't know when I was a child is that most children are considered sacrifices. Like, we are sacrificing you for our mission.
Ooh,
And my dad used to have a statement, my kids didn't sign the contract. So if
uh,
anybody ever said, well, your children need to, he said they didn't sign the contract, which is why we never moved into Newark. Because at the time that I was
mm,
in second grade, it was discovered I had a learning disability of dyslexia. And my dad knew I needed more
mm.
education, and they actually put us in a Christian school. It was a Dutch Reformed Christian school where they were willing to work with me one on one
Wow.
to help me.
More
He was also a
specialized care.
teacher,
Yeah.
so he understood that this base was going to be super important, and he
Your
was looking.
father was, I mean, it's clear your father was quite a man.
He
I
was,
want to ask you two
uh huh,
things. First of all, when you said that Dad went to Fuller for a year to discuss with, so I think you said Peter
Peter
Wagner.
Wagner.
Yeah, and you used the phrase "this idea of church." Could you unpack that a little bit of what that means or what it meant then?
Yeah, there was it was the conversation of missional. There was something going on at Fuller at the time where they were trying to understand how we were going to awaken the American church into the missional construct.
Mm,
And how that all works, I'm not sure. Dad was writing a paper, which my cousin who also went to Fuller says it's there. The question was always, did he actually finish the paper? The answer is yes, he did, because it's in the files.
it's in there, the
But
archives.
he was trying to join a vision of a bigger picture
Okay.
of of church so that he could continue the conversation around trans crossing over and bringing African American church to African church, but also
Mm,
others. And it was, yeah, there were quite a few. It wasn't just Peter. It was also right before they start, there was an organization that came out of this whole thing, and I forget what it was called. I know where they put their building, and I don't think it exists anymore, but it was the idea that there was a window of opportunity to get the gospel to places. But one of the things that I grew up with was we were going to find out what God was already doing versus going to do God's work. And we worked, and then so that's those are the things that stayed with me. When I think of church and when I talk about this, we're better together. I
yes.
move into 1978, June 12th, which is the day life changes. He died. He was not at home. He had actually left the mission and was working with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and had been for about a year and a half. We never went back because the mission would not hear his request to only go to he wanted to go for 2 years and not 4 years because he felt that the African church only needed him for 2 years.
Mm,
And it was not a short-term missions was not a conversation at the time. You either go for 4 or you don't go. And he decided. So what we ended up with was the African church coming to us. We had quite a few Africans visit us in our home in Reading, Pennsylvania, which is where we were living when he died. But the night that my father died, my mom called a few key people in our church at the time, and they all showed up. So we had about 70 people in our living room. And the pastor, who was not our pastor, it was that situation where he had been voted in to be the pastor. It was one of those groups that votes. The church had power to vote or decide who comes and goes.
hmm
And
hmm
so he was coming, but he drove all the way from Lancaster about an hour and a half to be with our family. And that I tell that story because that's when I look back on my life of why church, it's those moments. I cannot do this by myself. And as a
mm,
14-year-old, I surely couldn't do it by myself. I probably lived in a depression for the next 10 years, a low grade dyslexic ADHD depression of life will
mm,
never be the same, but it will never be good again.
mm,
But I had moments, and it was the youth group. It was my best friend Julie, whose mom brought me over to her house and said, "You can just be whoever you need to be." So what that did was a conversation of, isn't suffering the point? Isn't grieving the connection that we have with each other? It's
hmm
the one thing I can count on. If you're telling me that you've never suffered, you're either haven't gotten there yet or you're lying to me, because
mm,
humanity suffers. It's a key thing. And so I was known. I remember the day I told my mom we had moved to Philadelphia now. We've transferred, and the question becomes church or not church. I'm in college. I
Oh,
don't have
wow.
to go
Church or
anymore.
not church? All
And
right.
and I was like, not church, not this
Not
church.
church.
And I was walking in. I always went to church for the social aspect, for friends. If I had
Hmm.
friends there, I would go. If I didn't have friends there, didn't need to. It wasn't for the Sunday morning service, but the connections were important to me. And I remember walking in with her because she had been on something about church. And I said, well, when they start talking about the God I've met, then we can have a conversation. And of course, my mom was like, oh, great.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That's great, Martha. I remember I was 13 and I was playing the piano, and my dad and mom came down the stairs and they were like, it's time to go for church. And as I was playing, it hit me. I have done this every Sunday since
Hmm.
I was 0, not today. So I said to my parents, I've decided I don't want to go today. And I can see my mom. She's standing
Mm.
behind my dad, and her mouth is like dropping
Oh,
open.
yes.
Oh Lord, what are we going to deal with a 13-year-old child? And my dad, being my dad, said, "For today or forever?" And I said, "For today, just
Hmm.
today. I go every Sunday, and I don't want to go today." And he said, "So what will you do if I leave you home alone?" Well, I was the oldest of 4 children. What do you mean? What am I going to do? I'm going to be in an empty house with no one. And the
Hmm.
introvert in me was ready for that.
Yeah, right on.
And he said, okay, you can stay home today. And
Oh.
I will always appreciate that in that 13 to 14, I learned a lot from my dad because he never made it about me. He made it about my choices.
Hmm.
When he asked me that question, and we were living in a pretty tough neighborhood. We had moved into a neighborhood on purpose that would transform. Like, we bought a house. That was a big deal for the missionary girl. We never owned a house. So I was 13 or 12 when my parents bought their first home. And I didn't realize that was the American way. Everybody is supposed to own a home by a certain
Hmm.
time. It was in a neighborhood. It was a great house, but it was in a neighborhood that most of my friends, when people would drop me off, would be like, lock the doors, it's very dangerous here. I'd say, well, I got to jump out because I live here. And I watched my dad watch me stay safe, but not never degrading the people that I wanted to hang out with. And I often think of the Jesus story of Jesus being with the wrong people all the time. And I was known, I could find friends anywhere, Doug. So I made friends across the street, and I would go watch soap operas at this woman's house, much to my mother's sadness. But she had a brother who was probably about 27. His name was Putt Putt, and Putt Putt was on probation, but he loved to talk. So I would talk to him for hours outside, and my
Hmm.
dad would sit right by the window. And every time I came home, my dad was right there, and he would
Hmm.
smile, and then I would tell him whatever had happened. And I remember the day I walked in and I said, Dad, I tried Putt Putt's beer today.
Hmm.
And he said, did you like it? And I said, no. He said, well, I guess you won't be doing that again for a while.
What an ease and wisdom about your dad, Martha. As I listened to, and I've known something about your story, but I've not known Dad the way I'm getting to know him this morning. Do you imagine God to be more like your dad than not?
I do. I think God is very complex. Like, I don't see God as one thing. A lot of times I try to think of God as the ocean because that way, when someone describes God, I don't get upset. I think, oh, they've seen a different part of the ocean. But in
Wow.
terms of relational, I think God is both my mother and my father in some ways because truth is important. I don't disagree with my mom and my sister who are always like, but truth. I just believe with my whole heart that if I do what I've been asked, John 15 talks about my commandment to you is to love, that truth is, as one of my professors said in my last grad school, truth is like a beach ball. It will pop out of the water. So I don't spend a lot of time
Hmm.
trying to figure out things that are true or not true. I just know truth will stand.
Wow. That's
And
beautiful.
I am more, and my mom was more complex. That was part of my frustration sometimes with her is she would demand the truth herself, like, because there's different levels of it. So, yes, I think God is like my father, but I also think way past.
Hmm. Hmm.
And now, where I will say that one of the things that I have grown up with is that sense of there, that Jesus, the one that became like us, I would say dad was like that. Dad was
Hmm.
practicing a Jesus way that didn't demand power, but let go of it.
Let's talk about leadership. Let's talk about maybe leadership in general, but specifically leadership in the church. And of course, you and I know when we say church, it's like, well, are we talking about what are we talking about? We're talking about one church, a denomination, this kind of new Christian nationalist church conglomerate movement thing. But what's up with leadership in the church and power and all of this stuff that it's included in that? What's I don't even know exactly what I'm asking other than it's very problematic because you've been in a lot of different churches as I have, and you can walk in the door and you interface with good folks, and like you said, people that came and attended to you in your grief and probably brought food and all those kind of good ways to care for one another. But somehow if you stay in maybe most churches long enough, all of a sudden you interface with like executive leadership, we'll call it, be it, ministerial clergy and titles and whatever. And, we all have stories, don't we? If we've done enough of that, that it's like there's something really problematic about it. And I know it's complex and it's got to do with each different, the way it's set up, but there is something that's kind of similar in all those situations when the leadership is well, it's about power. What's going off in your
Well,
head as I talk?
I think back to what we were talking about before we jumped on the call, onto the podcast is that sense of I was telling you about Lecto Divino and Peter Gregg, who kind of has started this movement of prayer across the nations. But one of the things I watched with him is he had started a church, and when he began to get in the way of the church growing and becoming, he stepped out. And I think often leadership is demanding that the community become what the leader wants it to be, so that the community exists for the leadership versus
Hmm.
the leadership existing for the community. And I churches that I back and say, yes, this is what God is up to, are churches where when the leadership is no longer able, for whatever reason, to be a part of that community, whether their story has become larger. Peter Gregg's story had become larger, more
Hmm.
expansive, so he couldn't put the time in.
Right, right.
And and the reason I think that's important is my experience in this last church that I became a part of, which is Seattle First Baptist in Seattle. I grew into it, and I was allowed to grow into it because I was very good friends with the pastor, Tim Phillips, who always reminded me that it is a we, it is not an I. And we joke in my office that there is no I in team. If
Hmm.
you want a leadership and you want a church that is part of kindness, better together, as we started with, you have to be willing to understand that you are leading a group of people to become a we. They aren't all we's, they don't all want to be part of your team, but if you, as the leader, speak that way, it changes things. I changed how I thought of church because Tim quietly loved me through all my questions. He never said I wasn't allowed to ask. He would he would say, usually, you're right. That's a good thing. That's a good point. And I met other people in the community. Did everybody that I was a part of agree with me? Was I sitting in meetings where I was like, they've all lost their minds? Absolutely. But I had this sense of I'm part of this.
Hmm.
So I can no longer stand outside and criticize because I am now part.
I
And
see.
I don't think we've understood the seriousness in the American or the European, Eurocentric churches when Paul talks about the body, is across the sense of what Jesus said when he took the bread and broke it and said, "This is my body." And it wasn't until I was in a Lutheran church where you actually watch somebody break the bread
Yeah, right on.
and we share it that I went, wait, this is my body. Do like me. And one of my favorite words that I try to use, I was going to say remember, is the word remember. Jesus says, when you do this, remember me. Well, remember what?
Yeah, right.
Remember that I washed your feet. Remember that I called you friend, not just leader. Remember how I reached across the story to allow others to come into the story. There's a lot of remembering that those disciples would have had in their mind as he said that. And how do I remember as we break bread? I come from a family that I know more about things like Urbana, where you have 7,000 people taking communion together, than I know about the small local church, because that was my experience, was parachurch organizations. And was my dad and mom were my leaders. But as I became an adult, I had to say, now I have to be a part of something. What am I going to be a part of? And for a long time, I was known for saying things like, well, I'm not this.
Yeah, right.
We went and what I began to understand is we had put theology as a more important thing than a relational. And one of the things that I can say across the board when people say to me, why did you go to that church when wherever we were living? Because I went to churches of every denomination,
I
every
bet.
belief system. It was relational every time. My dad knew people. When we went to the church that we were a part of in Reading, it was a denomination. It was not reformed at all. It was the opposite. But we were there because he knew people in that when we were on the mission field. I read letters that he wrote back to us when we were kids, when he went back to get my things out of that crate and bring them home to me. I was reading these letters and he was talking about people that I wasn't introduced till I was like 12 years old, but he knew about them in 1970. So there were people that spanned our lives all through. And one of the
Mm.
things that I am very convinced of is God does relationship for me. He puts people that I need in my story. Sometimes it's you standing in a church at a music thing and introducing yourself, and then you show up somewhere else, and I go, who is this guy? And then one day I have to call you because something happened. And I go, huh. And for a long time, I was asking the question because church doesn't answer this very well because everybody's trying to figure out how to be the leader. I was asking,
Mm.
who am I and why am I allowed into God's family? Like, what do you want from me? And we hear this word call all the time. I heard people say I was called. Well, I was called to be a social worker out of absolute terror. I was 14 years
Mm.
old at my grandmother's house, and I said to God, quite literally, "You have to tell me right now what I'm going to be when I grow up, because I won't be able to figure it out, and you need to tell me now."
Mm.
I think my dad already knew I was going to be a social worker because he introduced me to a lot of social workers when I was younger. But I was reading a
Mm.
story at my grandmother's. My grandmother got Good Housekeeping. I read the story, and it was about a family that couldn't be put together because the bureaucratic system didn't think it would be a good family, and they belonged together with foster. It was a situation where the kids didn't have parents, and I went, I could do that. I could tell these people they lost their mind and they need to be together. I'll be the
Mm.
social worker. And quite literally, from that day on, I put my mind toward. I hated school. I didn't understand the need for it, but I knew I could be a social worker. So I went to a college that had a really good and and I didn't do 90% of it. 90% of it was people showing up and saying, here, like having conversations with me, but it was because I knew what I wanted. Well, when I got to church, I had no idea what I wanted, other than I wanted the 11th. I didn't want to be in church for 3 hours,
Okay.
but
And maybe still don't.
still don't. Did
Still
it
don't want to be
once,
in.
won't do it again. More understanding of the culture of Black church than I used to, but still don't want to do it. My sister and I say I did it once. The other thing I don't ever want to do again, Doug, is I don't want to do a church plant. I've done two, and I don't I don't want to start from zero. I am always thinking maybe God's going to call me out, but that's my story. I was always moving. When I moved to Seattle, I heard the words, "You're here. You're home." Not
That's a
home
long way from where you
but
grew up.
not, oh, and I was not happy. I was not a happy girl. I kept saying, in this white world, really? I
Mm.
had one African American friend who'd moved from Philly and he was working at Seattle Pacific, and he would
Mm.
call me and say, they're going to kill me. And I'd be like, Joe, nobody's killing you today. You'll be all right. But SPU is on, he was brought in to work with the African American kids. And I knew him in Philly because that was the last church plant I was a part of. Or first, actually, that was my first. But what happened at Seattle First Baptist was I was allowed, no one was telling me how church was going to work. I was allowed to define it. And what literally, there were two things that happened. One is they have an organization called Campanis. Instead of the church doing the social work stuff, they created this organization that places people in position in nonprofits.
Well, that's a healthy model.
It's a very healthy model. I wish we could figure out how to do it in more places. And I was in church on what's called Campana Sunday. And I said to my friend Dan, who was with me, and we have to remember the whole reason I'm even at Seattle First Baptist was to hear Tim preach because he had actually been at a different church, University Baptist. And the only reason I was even paying attention, because Martha always pays attention to the marginalized, my friend Dan had come out as a gay man and was looking for leadership and Christianity that was gay. And Tim is a gay man married to Patrick. So I'm already on the edge. But Tim's father had just died. And Tim was talking a lot about in church. He was a person that would bring himself to his sermons. So he often told personal story. This is one thing I would encourage particularly white leadership to do more often is tell their own story instead of others or telling other people
Mm.
how to live life. I think
And are you suggesting that that be done from the pulpit
yes.
or from up front?
Yes. Because when you do that, you become, I mean, I went to the Seattle School of Psychology and Theology, and we talk about story and how story changes things. They have now
Right.
scientifically found it. And I bring that up only because what I often hear, particularly in the white male community, is people either telling me how to live as a woman, as a person, or we're arguing about who God is.
Interesting. Those two things. There may
And
be more,
neither,
but those two things.
there is more to it, but there's
Yeah, sure.
also, but when I divide it out, why I divide it that way is we're either trying to figure out how people fit in with each
Yeah.
other, or we're trying to do the theological side. And my thought is they should be together. This shouldn't
Right.
be a separate conversation.
Shouldn't be segregated, right?
When I walk out of church, I don't leave my Christianity or whatever it is my belief system is in the house. I mean, that was a building where I learned some things, but it goes with me. My story, usually I would hear Tim preach a sermon and I would have to live it out 3 times before the
So,
week was
Martha, let
out.
me ask you this. Martha, let me ask you this.
Yes.
I fully understand, or I understand the Martha who leaves church and lives out in the world. I know that Martha. Well, who's the Martha that goes in the house? Why does she even
Go.
still with your? Why does she go inside the? I mean, what? Why go in the
So
house?
I first went because Tim was the pastor, and when I heard him preach this first time I heard him preach, I went, I can believe in God one more day if this man keeps talking this way. And it was him telling his own
Hmm.
story, and it was allowing space for my own questions. I
Okay.
didn't have to become anything. I didn't have to be anything for
And
him.
Martha, would you say that
Or
at that time in your life you couldn't find that somewhere else? You needed to go in the house to get it?
I had just graduated from a grad school that let me do that. And so I was no longer in a place where I was getting the
Okay.
the information. And I was asking the question. I mean, my mom, an example is when I first moved to Seattle, for 3 conversations, when I was talking to my mom, the first thing she would ask me is, did you find a church?
Right. Yeah.
And I said to myself, it didn't make sense because my mom wasn't a big, like, she had a sense of church, but she didn't care what I did with it. So I finally, on the third time, I would say not yet and leave it. I finally said, Marcia, I called her Marcia when I was
Marcia.
upset. Marcia, mom,
Marcia.
what is that about? Like, what is it when you say to me, did I find a church? Because I had left a very questionable situation, and she was the one that told me I didn't have to stay. So it didn't make
Okay.
sense to me. All of a
Yep.
sudden, she's like, did you find a church? And she said, I'm concerned that you find community. Well, and this is why I brought that word, like, we're better together. The question I always have is, do I have community? Well, at the time, I was in a grad school that I was getting better sermons in class than I'd ever heard because they were
Okay.
talking about the God that I had met. They were
Okay.
talking about suffering. They were talking about pain and separation. And I was with people that were asking questions, some of them stupid, some of them great. Yes, there are stupid questions, questions that you demand that somebody tell you how to live. That drives me
Mm-hmm.
crazy. So I said, oh, I've got that. On Monday night, I have this person. And then I would go out with beers with a good friend of mine. So I felt like I had community for 3 years. And then you graduate, or 4 years as it was me. And it's kind of like, but I also stepped back into the church because somebody who was seeking God was asking me to. He always says I
Okay.
followed him, but he invited me. So my
That's
friend
Dan. Is
Dan,
that Dan?
yeah, Dan said, will you go?
Wow.
I always go when I'm asked because invitation, I've learned there are times you should say no. But in this case, I felt that that was the right thing. And I also know when it's mine and not the other person's. And so we literally, when I started at Seattle First Baptist, the first Sunday I was there was when Tim preached his first sermon. I knew nothing about Baptist politics, and I could have kept it
Okay.
that way. But what we did is we sat in the balcony. We were usually the only people up there, and I would watch. I was never criticized for that by Tim. Tim used to call me the guard. He says my guardian angels sit in the balcony.
Hmm.
You watch over me. And I remember the first Sunday where he preached, and it was around the death of his father, and I felt so called to like support him in this
Hmm.
because I knew what losing your dad means. It's pretty
Right.
awful. But one of my worst experiences of church ever is as you leave the church. I don't understand why they have to have a receiving line because I have stood in those many times to greet a pastor or a person because I want to see their face.
Yeah.
Either I know them,
Make that connection. Right.
but preaching takes a lot of energy to be up front, especially for an introvert. And Tim was an introvert. So I remember I wrote a note because I was like, don't want to say it because he won't remember it and he's too tired.
Hmm.
So I just wrote a note and gave it to him. And that's what started our friendship. And one time I remember we had in another church, and it was a family that I knew quite well, and the son had come to preach, and it was a beautiful sermon. He was from Cyprus. He was a missionary in Cyprus, and he had preached in our church, and I was standing in line just to say, hi, Alistair. It's one of the Hoplers, just wanted to thank, because I knew his mom quite well. And the man in front of me, and this is why I say I hate this line, it spent 10 minutes. This man had preached 40 minutes asking him why he wore a collar. And all I kept thinking is, you've got to be kidding me.
Oh yeah. I'm sure you were thinking a few other things
We aren't allowed.
that you might not want to.
But I was, but, but what I watched in that moment was my friend Alistair show grace that I would not have had. That
Oh,
man would
I
have been
see.
wearing a collar. He laughed when I got there. He laughed and he said, "Yeah." He also explained. He answered the questions, which also wouldn't have happened for me.
Right.
He took. He said, "Well, I am from Cyprus," and then I'm standing behind going, "No shit." I will. Sorry, you can take that out.
No, we're going to keep that.
But that's what my mind
Yeah.
was thinking that. And when I got up to him, he just laughed and said, yeah, people just don't understand. Because, and I bring that up because I often feel it's in those moments there's this us and them. I remember going with my aunt to a Catholic church, and we talked about the priest and how he was friendly, and she couldn't believe that he would talk to people. And of course, I'm the exact opposite. If you're a leader and you're not talking to your people, then what are you doing? I don't believe in separation of leadership. It doesn't mean you have to talk to everyone. I do know some places where people have to protect themselves. They have to take care of themselves because people want too much. That doesn't mean that you don't know what the pulse is of your community. And I for 10 years. No, I'm not joining another church. It will take away my belief of the large church, and
Okay.
I can't do that.
Okay.
By now, I've gotten a job through Campanis. I've connected to Campanas. And part of why I went to Campanas is I heard the leader at the time, who was also a pastor in the church, say, this is a place where you're no longer alone. And the one thing I didn't like about being a social worker, I didn't realize what a gift I had that I worked with 30 amazing social workers because we all went and did our separate things. We did come back, and I had a great community at Bethana where I worked for almost 13 years, but we were all stressed all the time because we were working with children. I mean, I came back to the office one day to say, oh, you missed it yesterday. We had a kidnapping. We had a father who came
Mm.
with a gun and they had to lock down our office. I'm very thankful that I didn't come back to the office that day because it would have been a problem. And the reason I bring that up is it was in Seattle that I began to feel like I could be in church and do social services through community. So I got a job that for probably a good 3 years was like, why am I doing this job? What is this? It comes back to the people. I've learned more than about myself and I've learned more about leadership and how I used to be the person that was like, give me 50 hard people. I can handle clients. I do not want to deal with these crazy social worker coworkers. I was a supervisor for 15 minutes and I hate it. I don't like to manage people. I want to be in relationship. But we have worked through, I stayed through some really hard years at the organization I work in, and it was in the church building. So it was a very fun
Oh,
time for
interesting.
me
Interesting.
that I would get on an elevator and I would see Tim Phillips going to his apartment, which was also in the building, and we could chat for 15 minutes. And then, so I had this connection for a long time that for 7 days a week, I was in community and in church. And Campanis office was literally right up stairs as well. So there was this, like
Mm-hmm.
in the building, I felt connected. And the Sunday that I joined, and I had been a part of a Baptist church, so I knew how this works. You have to like tell the pastor you're going to do it, and then they call you down and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I did that recently.
And I was sitting in the back, and I heard God say, now's your turn. And I said, oh, no, thanks. No, thanks. And I always know when I say no to God, it's not going to last. And I said, why am I doing it now? And all of a sudden, the idea of global and local became a real story for me that God can work locally, which is where I am. I'm not a global person. And it doesn't take away. It's the more than rather than the less than. God's kingdom creates more than, not less than. And so there was the idea that you could work locally and think globally and be global. And part of what was happening is I was watching Brenda Salter McNeil, who's a pastor at Quest, and she was also on university staff. So I knew her from the days when her and my mom went to Kenya together. And I was watching her struggle with this dance herself because she was the pastor over at Quest. But she had come from Chicago where she was leading a huge reconciliation movement. And I was kind of wondering about how does this work that you kind of become small, what feels smaller to me. When I was in meetings in
Oh,
church, I would
okay,
be
right
like,
on.
are you kidding? Because in the Baptist story, you can actually support missionaries and never have met them.
Right. Oh,
That
yeah.
make no sense to me. Because then what you do is you make up the story of who they are.
Let me
They're
ask you
these,
this, Martha. Let me ask you
yes,
this.
I'm listening.
We've got maybe 10, 12, 15 minutes.
Okay.
So, what is church to you? I mean, if you meet somebody in the community, let's say that they've never been to church, but they have some kind of inclination or draw to go for whatever reason, and they say, I don't have much time. Be it we're on an elevator. Martha, I like you and I've come to know you and I trust you. When you go to church or you speak about it, what is church?
It's the
What is it,
place,
Martha?
it's the place where you can meet God. So it doesn't have to be a space. I met God last night at the Wicked movie. So I don't
Right.
believe that it has to be a building. It doesn't even have to have a pastor, but it's the place where God and humanity connect so that you can be kind and remember that you are not alone.
If God is everywhere as you speak, did you say the movie Wicked?
Yes.
Okay. And you have a God encounter. And these God encounters happen maybe more out of church, I don't know. But they definitely happen worldwide, whatever. But is there something
So
not just unique, but is there something important and vital about the fact that there is this building or this community that meets online that is set up the way we set up church with clergy, and it's a Sunday morning service, and there's a preaching moment, and there's the broken bread and the drank wine or wine to be drank? I mean, is there something about that that's a must? It's like this. That's a must. It's not to say that my encounter with God at Wicked in any way is
right,
anything less than what
no,
it was. But is there
and
something about?
it's a dance of question. And the dance of question is, I mean, the other side, like I say, the movie Wicked, but it's actually the two people sitting next to me, and I'm looking at how God has worked in our lives, and they're singing a song, and it connects me to the God story.
Yeah.
So, but I've also just came off part of what those words were was from an all church retreat. I was last weekend with my church. There were 70 of us at a free retreat because one of the pastors took a sabbatical and through her put in her grant when she was requesting money enough to take the whole church on a retreat. And it was the theme was together, better together. But I sat in a Bible study and I heard somebody say about like the we were talking about church leadership and when we were talking about the Levites because it was this Old Testament scripture and he said, because you have the more meaningful job. Those words turn me below because it's a separation.
Right.
I'm always looking for connection. So why do you go to a building? I met a woman at our church. I mean, one of the things we're doing is we're talking about the story of how did we end up here.
And is this Seattle Baptist?
It's Seattle Baptist. I'm at a retreat. We got 70 people. We can't even get 70 people on a Sunday morning, but we can get
Oh,
70 people because
really?
what I watched for an entire weekend is people are hungry for connection and to be seen. People left when they weren't seen correctly. There was a woman who thought she was going to be in a room by herself or with one other person. Because we had 70 people, we had to use the camp's cabins. So there were going to be 6 people. Well, that was a little too much. So she said to me, I'm leaving tomorrow. I can't stay. But I also met a woman who I said she's younger. She doesn't fit what you think of the church, which is these are people that have been there for 50 years. They grew up in the church. They're there because that's their home. I'm there because I was looking for home and found it. The
Hmm.
question is, why would you come? So she said, I have a child who wanted to go to church. I was raised with a Catholic mom who didn't make me go to church. So I Googled liberal churches that have a kids program and a choir. And then surprise, here she is. I think people come to church for different reasons. I don't know that there's a one stop
Hmm.
shop, but what I do know is that God surprises us and God's plans aren't my plans, my ways. And so if you had told me 20 years ago when I moved to Seattle, I'd be going to a Baptist church that was kind of liberal and confusing, I would have told you you lost your mind. I would have said, no, thanks. I can find my own people because I spent my whole life having to be in relationship with people I didn't want to be in
Yeah,
relationship
right
with.
on. Yeah.
But what I realized at this retreat is what I was missing was the sense that these people, even if they don't agree with me, even if they say things that I go, you really believe that? You were a doctor for crying out loud, and now you're retired. But she's got a more meaningful job. What they're really saying is, you know God differently. And I have been asking the question my whole life what does it mean not to work for God? Because when you grow up in a missionary home
Yeah.
and all your friends are pastors, what you have as examples are people that work for God.
Work for this.
And what I learned by working for God in an organization that was a Christian organization that people way too often use the working for God as a way to get power and to serve their own egos. So what I'm looking for are places where the ego is being melted. And our church is a co-pastored by 2 women. I was on leadership when that decision was made. I talked to many a person to explain to why this would be a good idea. But we have created a hierarchical culture. And I believe we did that to serve a certain group of people. And
Hmm.
it's not true. So some people might tell them not to go to church. I did family therapy for a while and I had a
Yeah.
family that talked about going to church. They had to go. It was the only day in their week that they would have time to spend together. And because of the tension in that family, I looked at them and I
Mm-hmm.
said, maybe you don't want to go tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
I should have said, maybe you don't want to believe in Jesus anymore. The response and the fear and the terror, because we have built up this idea that if I'm not doing it, God, I'm not being who I'm supposed to be. And I think that's why Christian nationalism has become such a part of our culture, because somehow I have a friend who voted for Trump last time. And I said to her, why? What is it for you? I don't care about all the people, but you. And what she said to me, and I believe this is a false truth that we live on. She said, what I'm figuring is if he's in, then I can vote for Pence in the next election.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But this is the key here, Doug. I can get God back into the White House. God becomes a pawn. For me, he was a 52 quarters. When I wanted something from God when I was younger, I wanted my 2 quarters. I wanted to pick my Coke. And I told God, this is how it's going to go. I remember the day that my idea of God changed. It was June 12th, 1978, because my deal with God was if we're going to die, when you live in Africa, death is very much a part of your story. People die all the, it's a,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was actually seen by a psychiatrist because they thought I had the fear of death. And I might have, because we talk about it all the time when I was in
And
Kenya.
you saw it. You witnessed
I
it.
saw it. My dad was taking a taxi one time and my mom was worried. And so she said something about dad taking a taxi. We had a very good friend who was killed in a taxi accident. And people die all the time in
Mm-hmm.
car.
Yeah.
I thought my
Yes.
dad was going to die in a car accident. He and my mom always connected my fear to the power of prayer. And she said, so you need to pray. Doug, it was the first time in my life I prayed. I was probably 4. And we had a path from our house to what we called our banda, which was a concrete round building. And I remember walking that path for a half an hour and telling God that my father could not die. So my deal with God was, if we're going to die, we all die together. That's how it should go. And I remember going, you broke your deal.
Yeah.
God's God's sense of humor was, ha, that was your deal, not mine. And
Good.
so the pawn is when people think they're in charge of God.
So we're
I
back
find,
to power. It's a power
well,
trip.
power, and it becomes my job to decide who gets to come into the God house
Yeah.
and who stays out.
In some sense of false
And that
security.
has never been my job. I always say to people, why do people keep trying to do God's job? They should do their job. We might get somewhere, which is to love each other. And at this retreat, I began to be able to see each
Mm-hmm.
person as an individual that fit the body. We read scripture that way. The the staffing had done some really good work behind the scenes. There's a movement they're working with that is trying to create this better together kind of idea. We've lost it because of COVID. So we have to figure out
Yeah.
how I mean, people figured out, the introvert in me figured out, I'd rather watch you on TV and not have to deal with all the people.
Okay. Okay.
However,
All
that
right.
isn't who I'm created to be. And one of the things, maybe even in closing, when I asked God, who am I? And there was a lot of questions for the God of the universe from the ages of 14 to about 45. I mean, it wasn't my plan to come to Seattle and to get a master's degree and stay here for 23 years. But God said to me, I don't know if you've ever played with a rector set. It's those sticks,
Oh, yes.
or there's another one, but basically you use these little plastic things to connect your sticks so you can build whatever you choose to build. And God said, you're the plastic. You're the connector.
Hmm.
You're the thing that when I ask you to show up, you will connect people to the bigger story. But to do that, you have to be in the smaller stories. And that's why I go to local church. Because
Boy,
in
that's,
local church, I can
yeah.
practice what I have to do in the bigger story. And I don't get every story. I know a lot. And God says, not yours. Don't touch it. I get the calls after the fact. When the all hell broke loose, I will get the call. Did you know? Yeah, I knew. But you don't get to do everything because then you become the power. I just
Yeah.
go where I show up, and then I'm confused when everybody is not wanting to talk about what they said they wanted to talk about. I mean, I lived through the years. I remember thinking I'm leaving Seattle today when I found out the Marcel and the Driscoll story was here, because the one story I did not want to have the conversation about ever again
About.
was my place as a woman in the Christian community. Because if the Imago Dei is true and I am created in God's image, then you have to put God, the image of a woman, in that story. And if you can't do that, you have a problem. And it isn't God's problem.
Martha Hopler, you and I, truly, it's a Saturday and I like my Saturdays.
Me
But I
too.
could keep, you too, I could just keep asking you questions and listening to you and having a few comments. But I could keep doing this like at least 3 or 4 more hours. There's so much more to talk about.
That is always the joy.
So
We are finite people in an eternity story.
you're a fascinating human being. You truly, and I've told you this, you're one of my favorite people on the planet.
Well, it's right back at you.
And
It's right.
when I really do, when I think of you, even when I haven't talked to you for a while, I think of people that I've met that have no faith, that I love deeply, and they make me a better human being. And then I think of other people that are that, and they have a faith. And there's something about the combination of that that I just go, I can say to somebody, I'm a Christian, and then talk to Martha Hopler, and you'll know the kind of Christian I aspire to be. You are so embodied in the world. So I just want to tell you that I love you.
Thanks.
I so appreciate this conversation. To think that all that you've been through, and you attend a local church, and you spoke about a powerful experience that you had with a group of 70 people.
And one of the
Yeah.
keys for me is it's willing to change. It's not easy, but it's willing to change with the times. And to have a co pastor model
Mm,
is new. One of the things that I ran into is this idea that we can change, but we don't want to. And
mm.
our pastor just preached a sermon on how nostalgia can be
Yes,
dangerous.
yes, yes.
There's a and I and people will tell you, oh yeah, she'll go after you for that, which is, don't tell me we did this. This is how we've always done it. I mean, I was really fortunate when I was in grad school to meet Brian McLaren as a professor, but I
Yeah,
remember him talking about the seven Jesuses. And he has a book where he talks about how we've created seven Jesuses because it depends on what group you're in. And I was laughing because being a missionary kid and being me, I had met all seven. I knew what he was talking about
yeah,
when he
right,
said
right.
that. But what I will say is what we want to do is we want to bring all those Jesuses into one. And my question is, are we willing to change to do that? Because he also said everything has to change. And what we don't want to change is what makes us feel safe. And our
Yeah,
question is why? What are
yeah.
we protecting? So why do we have to meet on Sunday morning? We used to do it
Hmm.
for a reason of milking the cows. Well, the cows are not in the city. I mean, it was a crazy church meeting when we were church planning, and my biggest fight was we were meeting on Thursday nights, and everybody said we should meet on Sundays because that's when people expect us to meet. Do you know what we miss by going to church on Sunday? All the political shows. I figured out why Christians don't need to be political. They're never home to watch the TV on Sunday morning when all the political shows are having conversations. When I
That's
stayed home and watched the political shows, I was like, oh, this is how I stayed out of politics. I didn't know these existed because for 100 years I went to church on Sunday where they told me I didn't have to be political.
mm,
But I have to be political because everything is political.
goodness.
But
That's a
anyway,
that's a no that's a really really great place to stop at least for today.
but can I ask a question?
Oh gosh, you can.
Can we do another show where we talk about psychology and theology and how we've separated them and how it makes a very confusing church?
We absolutely can.
Because I believe that the reason your book that I did read the whole thing, which is not usual for me, so just know that, was the first time that I read a book that I was reading about my faith and I was reading about the psychological story that I believe we all carry.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I believe, and I did do a talk on this at the Seattle School of how we've divided out psychology and theology, even in the school that
Hmm.
claims
Hmm.
it. My hardest understanding was why all the pastors, I would walk into the area of, and this was after I graduated and they had the place in Seattle. And I would walk in and I could tell you who was at the table based on the conversation. And the pastor types were all sounding very individualistic and power hungry in a way, not in the same way that I've heard in other places, but that we as an American culture have created an individualism, and
Mm.
it is, I'm actually listening to some stories that are helping me understand why it's so strong in the West, because you
Mm-hmm.
had to survive that way.
Yes.
But it doesn't bode well in the church. And I have had situations where I am like, we leave our freaking brain humanity at the door.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so
Yes.
I would love at some
We will do
point
it.
when you think that there's a
We,
podcast we
we,
could
we
do,
will do it.
because Jonah, the book Jonah, was the first time that I felt like it came together. And I've given that book
Well,
to some men because I'm like, you should read this. Because
thank you.
because and you were saying, why you appreciate me, and I appreciate you for that very thing, that I can bring both to you,
Uh,
my faith and my psychology. And I have seen people that try after they've been trained in the psychological mode to bring Christianity, but they bring it with power. They're some of the most
mm,
narcissistic people. Like, I have friends who are like, I won't listen to him, he's so narcissistic.
mm,
And it's this idea, because I don't think you can do it unless you're willing to do it in community. But to be in community, you have to step
mm.
off the pulpit
Okay. Yeah, we got it. We got more to talk about.
always. But it's good. We're done for today.
Have a blessed Saturday.
Hey, you
And
too.
with whatever you do with your Sunday, have a good one for that. Thank you.
I will greet people at the door and maybe leave after. We'll see. But I am going to get to be social worker. I'm going to go make meals for a lot of people for
Beautiful.
Thanksgiving. I have
For
to do it all
Thanksgiving.
right now in this culture of nobody cares about anybody.
Get to go do that. Nobody
Yeah,
better to do it.
we'll
Stay with me
see.
here. Stay here with me when I click off or when I
Okay.
stop the recording because we got to watch it upload. We don't want to lose it.
Okay.
Wow, everybody that has listened in, thank you for being with us. It's been a good morning. Bless you, Martha Hopler. I'm going to hit the stop button.